Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today I want you to imagine stepping into a cutthroat corporate boardroom.
Oh, I'm your resident expert, and I can safely say I know where this is going, and it is intense.
Right. So imagine the CEO of this massive, highly disruptive startup has just, out of nowhere, announced he's leaving.
Just dropping a total bombshell.
Exactly. And immediately, once the initial shock wears off, his top executives are just at each other's throats. I mean, aggressively jockeying for the top job before the guy has even packed up his desk.
It's ruthless.
It really is. Now, what if I told you that boardroom was actually the inner circle of Jesus's disciples?
It completely shatters that stained glass window image we usually have of them, doesn't it?
Completely.
Because we are so conditioned to read ancient religious texts looking for these peaceful, serene, spiritual lessons. We expect, like, quiet contemplation or moral fables told on a sunlit hillside.
Yeah, we want the Sunday school version. But the source material we're diving into today, which is an analytical breakdown of Matthew chapter 18, it does not read like a gentle lesson at all.
No, not even a little bit.
It reads like a high-stakes political thriller. And our mission today for this deep dive is to completely bypass those standard, sanitized interpretations. We are going to dig into the fierce historical drama, the intense political tension, and the bare-knuckle power struggles of first-century Judea that are hiding right there in plain sight.
Because once you see the political maneuvering happening beneath the surface of this text, you literally cannot unsee it. It changes your entire reading of the history.
Okay, let's unpack this because we really need to set the scene for you. The timing of this power struggle is absolutely everything. It happens in a very specific, incredibly volatile moment for this movement.
It really does. This chapter unfolds right after two massively significant events that would have given the disciples major psychological whiplash.
Right.
So first, you have the Transfiguration.
Right, and just for anyone who might not be totally familiar with that term, that's the moment where Jesus takes his top inner circle up a mountain and essentially reveals his divine glory.
Exactly.
It's this massive supernatural validation of his absolute authority. So they are riding this ultimate high, thinking their leader is about to literally take over the world.
Yeah, they're looking at him thinking, this is it. The revolution is finally starting. But then, immediately after that incredible high, Jesus drops a bombshell.
The second prediction.
Right. His second explicit prediction of his own death. He tells them point blank he's going to be killed by the authorities.
Which is, I mean, imagine you're a disciple in that exact moment.
The psychological state of the group must have been pure panic. The stakes are suddenly life or death. Their leader has essentially announced his impending departure, and the pressure is just crushing them.
And here is where human nature really kicks in. Because Jesus has just predicted his death, you would think the disciples would respond with, I don't know, deep spiritual mourning or quiet reflection.
You'd hope so.
But instead, they become intensely obsessed with this looming vacuum of power. They actually start a fierce debate over who is the greatest.
It's a painfully human reaction, honestly.
Yeah.
They're staring down the barrel of a regime change, and they just want to know who holds the reins when the dust settles.
I kept thinking about this while reading the sources. The disciples, they weren't asking a philosophical question about the nature of greatness.
No, not at all.
They were asking who gets the corner office. They are actively positioning themselves for political and administrative control of the movement. So break down that maneuvering for us, because the historical context of who is vying for what is just fascinating.
Well, the two main power players here are Peter and Judas.
Okay.
So let's look at Peter first. Earlier in the narrative, Jesus told Peter he was giving him the keys to the kingdom. Now, in a first-century context, holding the keys wasn't just some, nice metaphor for getting into heaven.
Right.
It was a literal administrative title. It meant you were the Lord Chancellor of the household.
Kind of like a prime minister, like the guy who runs the day-to-day operations of the kingdom while the king is away.
Precisely. So Peter fully expects to step into that prime ministerial role. He sees himself as the obvious successor. But then on the other hand, you have Judas.
The treasurer.
Right. Judas is acting as the treasurer for the group. He literally holds the money box.
Which, I mean, in an ancient nomadic survivalist movement, that is actual tangible power.
Exactly.
You have to buy food, secure lodging, maybe pay bribes or tolls. If you control the purse strings, you control the logistics.
Right. And in Judas's mind, his control over the community's finances gave him ultimate prominence. So you have the guy with the fancy administrative title going head-to-head against the guy who actually controls the cash flow.
It is incredibly pragmatic and honestly ruthless. But then Jesus steps right into the middle of this tense boardroom environment and just completely subverts the whole thing. He brings a child into the middle of the group, and he says in verses 3 and 4, let me just quote it here, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven."
What's fascinating here is that elevating a child in the ancient Roman and Jewish world wasn't a cute, heartwarming illustration.
Not at all.
No, in that culture, a lowly child had absolutely zero status, zero legal rights, and basically zero political leverage. They were entirely dependent.
So by placing a child in the center of this power struggle, he's not saying, be innocent and playful.
Or from it.
He's delivering a stinging, dramatic rebuke of their power-hungry maneuvering. He's looking at these guys fighting over the Lord Chancellor and Treasurer positions and basically saying, you are fundamentally misunderstanding the entire organization.
He takes their corporate ladder and just snaps it over his knee. He tells them that to lead this new community, they have to willingly accept the lowest possible social rank.
But, and this is a big but, tearing down that corporate ladder creates a massive practical problem.
Oh, absolutely.
If you remove the heavy-handed boss and you tell everyone to be like a zero-status child, how do you keep the organization from falling into total chaos? You still need some kind of framework.
And that is exactly what Jesus introduces next.
Yeah.
He lays out this revolutionary step-by-step process for resolving internal conflicts and governing the community.
Right.
He says in verse 15, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. And if that doesn't work, you bring one or two others, and finally you tell it to the whole community.
Okay, I have to push back a little on this, though, because if you abandon the rigid rules of the surrounding culture, and your main mechanism for discipline is just, like, having quiet one-on-one conversations to sort out your faults, doesn't that sound incredibly fragile? I mean, think about how quickly rumors or grudges tear apart a modern workplace, let alone a first-century movement under extreme duress.
It sounds like a complete recipe for anarchy, especially when you consider the political tension of the time. Jesus' teachings here directly confronted the dominant structures that everyone knew and expected.
Right, because the Romans were everywhere.
Exactly. The Roman hierarchical structure was brutally top-down. Order was maintained by sheer military force and intimidation. And even the contemporary Jewish leadership models also relied really heavily on strict status and rigid authority.
So everyone around them is operating on these strict hierarchies, and Jesus is telling them to act like lowly children and talk out their problems privately.
Exactly. To really see how wild this was, let's contrast it with the Qumran community.
Oh, the Dead Sea Scrolls group.
Right. They were an isolated Jewish sect operating around the exact same time. And they had this foundational text called the Manual of Discipline.
And honestly, a title like Manual of Discipline tells you exactly what kind of vibe they had going on.
It was incredibly strict. It was an exhaustive, highly legalistic penal code.
Wow.
Yeah, if you spoke out of turn in a meeting, your food rations were cut. If you laughed foolishly, you were punished. Everything was highly structured, heavily regulated, and strictly policed by superiors.
So basically a literal rule book for micromanaging human behavior.
Yes. But Jesus does the exact opposite here. He shifts the entire community from rigid legalism to relational principles.
That's a huge pivot.
It is. He doesn't give them a manual of minor infractions. He gives them a process for restoration. This shift from legalism to principles was a profound cultural rebellion. Ultimately, it was the specific principle-based relational ethos that defined early Christian identity as it began to separate from mainstream Judaism.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. They are building an anti-fragile community based on relational repair rather than a community based on fear of a legal manual.
Precisely.
But let's be real, even relational principles inevitably hit a wall. What happens when someone absolutely refuses to participate in that repair?
Yeah.
Because the text gives us a final step, and it leads to this shocking moment of dramatic irony.
It really does. So the step-by-step conflict resolution procedure, which is actually drawn from older Hebrew Bible legal traditions, it has a breaking point.
Right.
In verse 17, Jesus says that if the person refuses to listen to the individual and then refuses to listen to the wider group, they are to be treated as a Gentile or a tax collector.
Meaning excommunication. That is the ultimate line in the sand for that culture. Treat them like an outsider. But here's where it gets really interesting. Think about who actually wrote the book of Matthew.
Oh, yes.
The Apostle Matthew, the very person putting the ink on the parchment, instructing this community to shun someone and treat them like a tax collector, was actually a former tax collector himself.
You really cannot write better historical irony than that.
You really can. And we have to remember what a tax collector was in that era. We aren't talking about, like, a mild-mannered IRS auditor.
No, not at all.
These were local Jewish citizens who contracted with the occupying Roman military to squeeze their own neighbors for taxes, tolls, and tariffs. They were notorious extortionists. They were considered traitors, complete sellouts.
They were the ultimate outcasts, entirely despised by their own people.
So Matthew is literally writing down his own former despised profession as the absolute baseline for an outsider. It would be like a notorious, corrupt hedge fund manager writing a new moral rule book and saying, if they don't listen, treat them like a hedge fund manager.
Exactly. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this irony isn't just a funny coincidence. It highlights the early community's deep, ongoing, and quite frankly, messy struggle with boundaries.
Messy is definitely the word for it.
Right. They are trying to figure out how to maintain community standards while being founded by people who themselves used to be the worst kind of outcasts.
Because Matthew knows exactly the sting of being that outcast. He knows what it feels like to be hated by his neighbors. So when he writes, treat them like a tax collector, it carries this incredible, heavy double meaning. Yes, it means boundary lines, but it's written by a guy who was eventually allowed inside the boundary.
Exactly. It shows that they are wrestling with the tension of human flaws. How do we keep order without becoming the rigid Qumran community, but also without letting toxic behavior just completely destroy us?
And that raw human struggle with toxic behavior leads us right into the final major piece of this puzzle. Because dealing with messy humans naturally prompts Peter to ask a very practical question about the absolute limits of patience.
Right.
He's basically asking, okay, if we aren't using a penal code, how much of this messy human behavior are we supposed to tolerate before we cut someone loose?
Is the logical next question. I mean, if we're doing this one-on-one conflict resolution and the person just keeps messing up and apologizing, when do we finally get to kick them out? Peter wants a measurable standard.
So Peter comes to Jesus and asks if he should forgive a brother or sister who sins against him up to 7 times, which honestly, in any workplace or friend group today, forgiving someone 7 times for the exact same offense sounds incredibly generous.
Very generous.
I think most of us tap out at like 2 or 3.
Easily.
But Jesus replies in verse 22, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times.
And to illustrate what he means by 77 times, Jesus immediately launches into the parable of the unforgiving servant. To really grasp the weight of this story, we have to look closely at the brutal economic mechanisms of first-century Judea.
Okay.
This parable isn't just a nice fairy tale. It operates perfectly within the terrifying Roman-dominated economic system.
So let's look at those economic realities. Set up the math of this parable for us because the numbers here are completely absurd.
They are entirely disproportionate. That's by design. In the story, a king is settling accounts with his servants. The first servant owes the king 10,000 talents. Now, a single talent was roughly equivalent to 20 years of wages for a day laborer.
Wait, 20 years of wages just for 1 talent?
Just for one, and he owes 10,000 of them.
That's completely impossible.
Yes, it is an astronomical, impossible debt. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of years of labor. A sum so vast it could never be repaid, not even if he worked for 1,000 lifetimes.
Wow.
And under Roman law, the mechanism for dealing with this was brutal. The man, his wife, his children, and all his property were ordered to be sold to partially recoup the debt. Debt slavery was a very real, very terrifying reality in this economy.
It's the complete destruction of his entire bloodline. But the servant begs for patience, and shockingly, the king doesn't just give him more time. He completely cancels the impossible debt. He wipes the slate totally clean.
But then the sheer human audacity kicks in. That same servant, whose life and family were just spared from slavery, goes out and finds a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii. Now, a denarius is about 1 day's wage, so it's roughly 100 days of labor.
Which is a real amount of money, sure, maybe a few months' rent. But compared to hundreds of thousands of years of labor, it's a petty annoyance.
Exactly. But instead of showing the mercy he just received, the first servant physically chokes the man, demands payment, and has him thrown into a debtor's prison until he can pay.
So essentially, Jesus is using the crushing reality of the Roman economy, a system that routinely destroyed entire families over debt, as a stark political and theological metaphor. He's using the terror of debtors' prison to make a point.
Yes.
So, what does this all mean for this new community? How does framing this within such a cutthroat economic reality change how we understand this call for radical forgiveness?
This raises an important question about the stark contrast between divine and human systems. In a Roman-dominated world where debt was an instrument of sheer terror and control, introducing the concept of an unpayable astronomical debt being completely forgiven purely out of mercy. It was mind-boggling. It defied all logic of the era.
It really puts our own grievances into perspective, doesn't it? The impossibly vast debt represents our own flawed standing before the divine, while the petty 100-day debt represents how we view other people's offenses against us.
Precisely. The parable demonstrates the absolute necessity of radical forgiveness grounded in infinite divine mercy. You cannot receive the cancellation of an impossible debt and then act like a Roman debt collector toward your neighbor.
Right.
It contrasts an unforgiving, brutal human world with a completely different kingdom principle.
It is the ultimate subversion of the cutthroat boardroom drama we started with.
It really is.
Think about the arc here. The disciples came in wanting to know who got to be the prime minister and the treasurer. They wanted status.
Yep.
And instead, Jesus tells them they have to become like zero-status children. He tells them to privately talk through their issues without a rigid, punishing manual of discipline. And finally, he tells them they have to endlessly forgive the petty debts of their peers because an impossibly vast debt has already been wiped clean for them.
It completely reframes the entire concept of power. True greatness in this framework isn't about leverage or holding the purse strings or strictly enforcing the rules. It is about how freely you can extend the mercy you've been given. And I think that leaves us with a profound tension to consider as we wrap up.
Oh, let's hear it.
Think about the tension between that innate human ambition we saw in the disciples, a drive to climb the ladder, and this call for infinite mercy.
Right.
If a society actually embraced this.
Not at all. If you enjoyed this deep dive and found a few aha moments today, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out when we unpack a new topic.
Absolutely.
And don't forget to check the description below. We've got some exclusive links down there for you to explore the historical context we talked about today even further. Thanks for joining us on this journey through first century Judea. Get ready, because our next deep dive will be even more intense as we tackle another incredible piece of history. See you then. And as you go about your week, just remember that boardroom power struggle we started with today. It turns out the most revolutionary power play you can make in a cutthroat world might just be to tear up the scorecard entirely.